For most of history, salt was power. It decided which armies could march, which cities could endure sieges, and which states could tax, trade, and expand. Yet in modern kitchens, especially in the United States, one particular salt has become so common that it is barely noticed at all. It sits in open crocks beside stoves, scattered between fingers, assumed to be neutral, universal, and interchangeable. Many cooks believe it is chosen simply because it is easier to control, or because chefs prefer the way it feels in the hand. What often goes unexamined is how this specific salt came to dominate American professional kitchens, and what that reveals about systems of religion, regulation, industrialization, and labor that extend far beyond food. To understand why kosher salt is so widely used today, we have to step away from taste and technique and look instead at process, at who needed salt, how they needed it to behave, and how industrial systems responded. This story is not about a superior product emerging naturally. It is about infrastructure quietly shaping habit, and habit eventually being mistaken for necessity. Salt has been produced, traded, and regulated for thousands of years, but kosher salt enters the historical record relatively late. Its origins lie not in haute cuisine or restaurant culture, but in religious law. In Jewish dietary practice, meat must be prepared according to specific rules laid out in the Torah and later rabbinic texts. One of these rules concerns blood. Consumption of blood is prohibited, and while slaughter methods remove most blood, additional steps are required to draw out what remains in the flesh. This process, known as koshering, involves soaking meat in water and then salting it heavily to extract residual blood before rinsing it away. For this purpose, salt needed to meet very specific criteria. It had to be coarse enough to draw moisture out efficiently, but not so fine that it dissolved too quickly. It needed to adhere to the surface of meat without penetrating too deeply, and it could not contain additives that would interfere with the process. Over time, certain types of coarse-grained salt became standard within Jewish communities in Europe and later in North America. These salts were not originally defined by flavor, but by function. When Jewish immigrants arrived in the United States in large numbers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they brought these practices with them. Kosher butchers required reliable supplies of salt suitable for koshering meat. Salt producers responding to this demand began to manufacture and market salt specifically for this purpose. The term kosher salt did not mean that the salt itself was kosher salt is inherently kosher, but that it was used in the koshering process. By the early 20th century, American salt companies such as Diamond Crystal and Morton were producing coarse salts designed for Jewish households and butcheries. These salts differed in crystal shape and density depending on production method, but they shared key characteristics: large grains, no iodine, and minimal additives. At this stage, their use was largely confined to communities that required them for religious reasons. What changed was not the salt, but the system around it. The early 20th century was also a period of rapid transformation in American food production and labor. Urbanization increased demand for processed and standardized food products. Refrigeration expanded the scale of meat distribution. At the same time, professional kitchens were becoming more centralized, regimented, and hierarchical. Hotels, rail dining services, institutional kitchens, and eventually restaurants needed ingredients that were predictable, scalable, and forgiving under pressure. Salt, as a tool, had to meet these new conditions. Fine table salt, which had become common through industrial milling, was efficient for mass packaging and domestic use, but it presented problems in professional settings. Its small grain size made it easy to oversalt food quickly, especially when seasoning by hand. Additives such as iodine and anti-caking agents, introduced for public health and storage reasons, could impart subtle off flavors or alter texture in certain applications. These were not catastrophic issues, but in kitchens operating at speed, small inconsistencies mattered. Kosher salt, by contrast, behaved differently. Its larger crystals dissolved more slowly, giving cooks more margin for error. It was easier to see as it fell onto food, easier to grasp between fingers, and easier to distribute evenly over large surfaces. Importantly, it was also cheap, widely available, and already produced at industrial scale for non-culinary reasons. Evidence suggests that by the mid-20th century, kosher salt began to migrate out of Jewish households and into broader American food culture, not through deliberate adoption, but through proximity. Jewish cooks worked in restaurants. Jewish butchers supplied meat to non-Jewish businesses. Food writers, many of whom trained in or observed professional kitchens, began to note the tools chefs used as implicit markers of expertise. Cookbooks followed kitchens, not the other way around. By the 1960s and 1970s, American culinary education was formalizing. Cooking schools, professional manuals, and eventually television cooking shows presented a standardized vision of what a proper kitchen looked like. Kosher salt, already common in professional environments, was incorporated into recipes and demonstrations. Measurements were often given in vague terms: a pinch, a handful, which implicitly favored salts that could be handled easily by hand. At no point did a governing body decide that kosher salt was superior. There was no centralized directive, no culinary council decree. The system worked through repetition. Ingredients that fit the workflow stayed. Those that didn't fell away. This is how many infrastructural defaults are formed. From a systems perspective, kosher salt occupied a unique position. It was not tied to a specific regional cuisine. It was not expensive or scarce. It required no specialized storage. It performed consistently across a wide range of tasks, from seasoning meat to finishing vegetables. And it arrived at scale through an existing industrial pipeline built to serve religious markets. Control over salt has historically been a lever of power. Ancient states taxed it. Medieval rulers monopolized it. Empires rose and fell around access to salt mines and trade routes. In the modern United States, that control shifted from the state to industry. Companies that could produce, refine, and distribute salt cheaply gained influence over how it was used, not through force, but through availability. Kosher salt's rise was not driven by taste preference alone. Blind taste tests consistently show that when adjusted for quantity, most salts taste similar. What differed was usability. And usability, in large systems, often outweighs subtle sensory distinctions. There are still gaps in the historical record. We do not know exactly when the first non-Jewish professional kitchens began using kosher salt exclusively. Written records rarely note such details. Oral histories suggest gradual adoption rather than a clear tipping point. Some historians argue that its spread accelerated alongside the rise of American restaurant culture after World War II, when standardized training and supply chains became more entrenched. Others point to the influence of mid-century food media, which normalized the tools of professional kitchens for home cooks. What is clear is that no competing salt mounted a structural challenge. Sea salts varied too much in crystal size. Fine salts lacked forgiveness. Specialty salts remained expensive and context-specific. Kosher salt sat at the intersection of cost, scale, and function. Comparatively, this pattern is not unique. Roman garum, medieval hardtack, and 19th century canned foods all became dominant not because they were beloved, but because they worked within the systems of their time. They traveled well. They stored reliably. They fit the constraints of labor and logistics. Kosher salt belongs to this lineage. It is not an artifact of taste culture, but of process optimization. Outside the United States, its dominance is far less pronounced. European kitchens often rely on fine sea salt, adjusted by experience rather than hand feel. In parts of Asia, seasoning systems evolved around soy sauce, fish sauce, and fermented pastes, reducing the centrality of salt altogether. The American preference for kosher salt reflects American conditions: large kitchens, high labor turnover, and an emphasis on reproducibility. Over time, what began as a tool became an identity marker. To use kosher salt was to signal seriousness, professionalism, and alignment with an inherited culinary norm. New cooks adopted it not because they evaluated alternatives, but because it was what serious cooks were seen using. Infrastructure had become culture. There was no decline of kosher salt because nothing replaced it. Instead, it was absorbed into a broader system of industrial food production and education. Even as specialty salts gained popularity for finishing and presentation, Kosher salt retained its role as the default working salt. It did not disappear. It receded into the background. Today, the choice of salt rarely feels political or historical, but it remains a quiet example of how food systems shape behavior. What is stocked by suppliers becomes what is taught in schools. What is taught becomes what is expected, and what is expected eventually feels inevitable. This matters because similar processes are still at work. Modern food systems continue to privilege ingredients that scale easily, tolerate abuse, and fit standardized workflows. These choices affect nutrition, labor conditions, and environmental impact, often invisibly. Kosher salt reminds us that even the most mundane tools carry the imprint of history. The next time a cook reaches into a salt crock without thinking, they are participating in a lineage that runs through religious law, industrial manufacturing, and the quiet logic of efficiency. No single decision created that moment. It emerged from systems aligning over time. Salt no longer decides the fate of empires, but it still reveals how power moves, not loudly, but grain by grain.